Candace Owens just left Democrats speechless.
Thank you, Chairman, for the opportunity to testify. I want to testify just as a Black American today, and I want to first start off by saying that white supremacy is indeed real, but despite the media's obsessive coverage of it, it represents an isolated, uncoordinated, and fringe occurrence within America. It's a fringe occurrence that is being used, in my opinion, by Democrats to scare Americans into giving up their votes to a party that can no longer win based on simple ideas, which is why we're seeing so many of these hearings back to back, despite other threats that are facing this nation. I want to reiterate that point. White supremacy is real, just as racism is real, but neither of these ideologies are real in this room. They have become mechanisms for the left to continue to call these hearings and to distract from much bigger issues that are facing this country and which threaten minorities. Much bigger issues that they are responsible for. White nationalism sounds a lot better as a threat than father absence. When are we going to call a hearing on the 74% of single motherhood rate in Black America today? My guess is probably never. Since Democrats are the author of that epidemic, which leaves us, Black Americans, 20 times more likely to end up in prison, 9 times more likely to drop out of high school, and 5 times more likely to lead a life in poverty and to commit crime. White nationalism also sounds a lot better than illiteracy rates. I'm assuming we're never going to call a hearing on that, which is a real epidemic that is facing Black Americans and minority Americans today. An epidemic which, by the way, has a lot closer of a tie to our nation's history of white supremacy. Slave codes in the early 19th century made it illegal for Black Americans to learn to read. Why? Because if slaves could read, they could access information. I don't believe that much has changed. On the most recent National Assessment of Educational Progress, just 17% of Black students scored proficient in reading at a 12th grade level. 83% of Blacks in America were not found proficient in reading at a 12th grade level. Are we going to have a hearing on that? Probably not. White nationalism also sounds a lot better than abortion as a threat, which has resulted in the slaughter of 18 million Black Americans since 1973 and points to a bigger crisis, which is the fact that the Black population growth has stagnated in this country. The crisis that in major cities like in New York, we have more Black babies that are being aborted than born alive. If we're talking about preserving lives and we're talking about white supremacy, we should probably have a conversation about that. But today, in this room, we're going to see Democrats try to connect the dots to white supremacy and the internet. So the question is why? So that people who have absolutely nothing to do with propagating white supremacy are censored, silenced, and controlled. What they are actually after is our permission to censor and silence and control any dissenting voices that go against the mainstream narrative that they wish to propagate. To give a glimpse into just how absurd and expansive the definition of white supremacy has become, I offer to the committee that I have been libeled and smeared by Democrat media cohorts as someone who supports white supremacy. You need but look at me to determine that that just isn't true. Why? Because I routinely say, Black people don't have to be Democrats. I am now considered somebody that is radicalizing people on the internet. What a radical idea. Black people waking up to the abuses and the Democrat Party, which has been instigated upon Black America over the last 60 years. There have been sincere attempts, just so everybody knows, to censor me on social media because I am radical. YouTube once censored me for criticizing Black Lives Matter. They reversed the censorship and they apologized and they called it a mistake. Facebook once censored me for calling out liberal supremacy as a threat facing Black America. What I said specifically was that in any community where liberal policies reign supreme, you will find that Black America is hurting. I stand by that assessment. Facebook reversed my censorship, apologized, and claimed it was a mistake. Of course, I'm fortunate that I have a big enough platform that when I get branded something extreme, I can reverse it, but the majority of Americans don't have that platform. The majority of Americans with dissenting opinions are silenced forever. Many words which have once held very serious meanings have come to take on a different definition over the last couple of years as Democrats have desperately tried to grapple with the fact that they are no longer able to manipulate Americans with broad claims and broad strokes of racism, sexism, misogyny, and the like. Words like racism, which today most nearly means anything or anyone that disagrees with a liberal, and terms like white nationalism, which today and in this room and upon this floor most nearly means that it's election time, America. It's time for the left to do what they do best: divide, distract, and hope to keep their most important voting bloc to their party, which is Black Americans, angry and emotional and reactive enough to keep voting for the same party that has systematically destroyed our families, sent our men to prison, and deferred all of our dreams. I would close out by telling you that this is not going to work. America, and more importantly, Black America, is waking up to the ploy. The bad acting, the faux concern, these hearings, it's not going to stop Black America from breaking the chains of victimhood, and it's certainly not going to stop me from being one of the loudest voices against it. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much for your testimony. Dr. Ballou, let me start with you. I'm going to recognize myself for 5 minutes. In your prepared testimony, you stated that the perpetrators of white supremacist violence in a lot of the recent episodes are often portrayed as bad apples or mentally ill or so on. And this gets us to a very difficult problem. I'm thinking about two relatively analogous episodes. One is of Omar Mateen, who was an admirer or a follower of ISIS, but he wasn't a member of ISIS, and apparently he'd had no contact with them that anybody could determine. He hadn't been trained by them, he hadn't plotted with them, but he followed them online, and then he went to the nightclub, the Pulse nightclub in Orlando, and assassinated 49 people. Then the terrorist who killed 11 people at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh, he also radicalized on the internet as essentially a follower of different white supremacist groups. But I don't think he was a member of any of those groups. I don't think he was trained by any of those groups. And so, and we're far more inclined to describe someone like that as...
Well, there it is. That wasn't just testimony. That was Candace Owens walking into a congressional hearing and completely challenging one of the central narratives that Democrats and the corporate media have spent years pushing. What made this moment so powerful wasn't that Candace denied racism exists. In fact, she explicitly said the opposite. She acknowledged that racism exists. She acknowledged that white supremacy exists. But then she asked the question that so many politicians and media figures refuse to answer. How big of a threat is it really compared to the problems devastating millions of Americans every single day? And that's where the room suddenly got uncomfortable. Because Candace didn't spend her time talking about fringe extremists. She spent her time talking about fatherlessness, educational failure, crime, poverty, abortion, and the collapse of the family structure. Whether people agree with every statistic she cited or not, the broader point was crystal clear. If politicians are genuinely concerned about improving the lives of Black Americans, why do these issues seem to receive so much less attention than topics that generate headlines, outrage, and political talking points? That's the question she forced into the spotlight. For decades, Democrats have presented themselves as the party that best represents Black Americans. They have consistently argued that government intervention, welfare programs, and progressive social policies are the solution to racial disparities. But critics like Candace Owens argue that after generations of these policies, many of the same problems remain, and in some cases have become worse. That's a debate many on the left would rather avoid. Instead, according to Owens, it's easier to keep redirecting attention toward emotional topics that can be weaponized politically every election cycle. And let's be honest, we've all seen this pattern before. Every election year, suddenly the media is flooded with stories suggesting America is on the verge of being overrun by racism, extremism, or some new existential threat that supposedly requires voters to rally behind Democrats. Then election season ends, and many of those stories disappear from the headlines. That's one of the reasons Candace's testimony resonated with so many people. She wasn't speaking as a Democrat trying to protect the party. She wasn't speaking as someone trying to score points with progressive activists. She was speaking directly to an audience that increasingly feels ignored by political elites. Another part of her testimony that stood out was her discussion about censorship. Now remember, this hearing was taking place during a period when there was enormous pressure on social media companies to police so-called misinformation and extremist content. What Candace argued was that these efforts rarely stop at actual extremists. Instead, the definition keeps expanding. At first it's white supremacists, then it's political dissidents, then it's conservatives, then it's anyone who questions a popular narrative. And that's where many Americans become concerned, because once institutions gain the power to determine which opinions are acceptable and which opinions are forbidden, that power rarely stays limited. The people making those decisions inevitably bring their own biases into the process. We've seen examples of that repeatedly over the last several years. Stories that were dismissed as conspiracy theories later turned out to be true. Experts who were mocked later ended up being vindicated. Political viewpoints that were labeled dangerous eventually became mainstream discussions. That's exactly why free speech matters. Not because every opinion is correct, but because nobody has a monopoly on truth. Candace also made another point that hit Democrats where it hurts. She challenged the assumption that Black Americans automatically belong to one political party. That idea has long been treated as almost unquestionable within Washington. But voting patterns have been changing. Recent elections have shown Republicans making gains among Black voters, Hispanic voters, working-class voters, and other groups that Democrats once assumed would remain permanently loyal. The reason that's significant is because political power depends on coalitions, and if Democrats begin losing support from voters they've historically counted on, it forces them to defend their record rather than simply relying on fear-based messaging. That's exactly what Candace was encouraging people to do. Look beyond the rhetoric, look beyond the headlines, look beyond the emotional appeals, and ask a simple question. Are the policies working? Because at the end of the day, that's what matters. Not slogans, not hashtags, not media narratives, results. Americans don't live inside political speeches. They live with the consequences of public policy. They live with rising crime, failing schools, economic uncertainty, and communities that have struggled for generations despite countless promises from politicians. And that's why speeches like this generate so much attention, not because they're politically correct, not because everyone agrees with them, but because they challenge assumptions that many people in power don't want challenged. Candace Owens walked into that hearing and refused to play by the script. She rejected the narrative that every discussion about race must end with more government control, more censorship, and more political fear-mongering. Instead, she argued that the biggest threats facing Black Americans are problems that politicians often ignore because solving them would require admitting that decades of progressive policies haven't delivered the results they promised. That's a message the left hates hearing. And judging by the reaction this testimony generated, it's a message they still don't have a good answer for. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. And let me know in the comments if more Americans should start challenging these narratives, the same way Candace Owens did during this hearing.